On January 18, 1918, the only freely elected multi-party assembly in Russian history met for the first time. It would also be the last. Lenin's party had seized power 2 months earlier, the one promising all power to the Soviets. It had just lost the vote, badly, under 25%, second place in their own revolution. So, what does a revolutionary government do when an election tells it no? He didn't lose an argument that night. He made sure he'd never have to have one again. Here's how he got there. By early 1917, Russia had been bleeding out on the Eastern Front for 3 years. Breadlines in the capital, soldiers refusing orders, a wave of strikes that turned into a full uprising within days. Tsar Nicholas II, last of a 300-year dynasty, abdicated within a week. A provisional government stepped into the vacuum, eventually led by a lawyer named Alexander Kerensky. That government had a plan: keep fighting the war and hold elections once things had stabilized. Lenin, watching from exile in Switzerland, treated that plan as a betrayal already in progress. In April, he made it back into Russia through Germany. Riding in a sealed train car, the German government was happy to arrange for a man who'd promised to pull Russia out of the war. Lenin arrived and immediately pushed for something more radical than reform. He wanted a second revolution, this one led by his own party, the Bolsheviks. His slogan was 3 words: peace, land, bread. By October, with Kerensky's government exhausted and discredited, Lenin's Bolsheviks made their move. Here's something worth correcting. You've probably seen the footage: soldiers storming gates, cannon fire, chaos at the Winter Palace. None of it is from 1917. It's from a reenactment the Soviet government staged in 1920, watched by about 100,000 people, and it became the template for every dramatized version since. The real event was almost bloodless. Small groups of Bolshevik-aligned soldiers and sailors walked into a barely defended palace and arrested the ministers inside. Historians have described it as one of the least violent uprisings in modern European history. Lenin himself, by most accounts, put it more bluntly afterward. The Bolsheviks, he said, had found power lying in the street and simply picked it up. By the next morning, the Congress of Soviets had voted to hand governing authority to Lenin's new government. He was 47 years old and, at least on paper, now ran the largest country on earth. On paper. There was still one loose end: the election he'd promised. He let it happen. The vote happened on November the 25th, 1917, a month after Lenin had already taken power by force. He let it go forward anyway. The breakdown shows where his real support was. The Socialist Revolutionaries, the party representing Russia's peasant majority, took the largest share, 40 to 45%. The Bolsheviks had their strength in the cities and the barracks, 43% in Petrograd, 46% in Moscow. More than 3/5 of the vote inside the army. Out in the countryside, where most of Russia actually lived, they barely registered. That's the arithmetic waiting for Lenin on January the 18th, when the Constituent Assembly finally convened in Petrograd's Tauride Palace. The session lasted about 13 hours. The elected delegates refused to simply endorse Lenin's decrees. So that night, armed guards loyal to the Bolsheviks locked the building. When the delegates came back the next morning, they found the door shut and a decree waiting for them. The Constituent Assembly was, in Lenin's own words, dissolved. Russia would not hold another free, competitive national election until the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, decades later. But the machine that made sure of that wasn't built afterward. It was already running before the votes were even counted. 3 weeks before that vote was even counted, while Lenin was still, on paper, sharing power with a multi-party Congress of Soviets, his government created the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission. Officially, its job was rooting out counter-revolutionary sabotage. Unofficially, it was Russia's first secret police force, a body that could arrest, interrogate, and execute without a trial, without a lawyer, without appeal. Lenin put a Polish-born revolutionary named Felix Dzerzhinsky in charge. Dzerzhinsky started with a couple hundred men. Within 3 years, the Cheka employed something like 200,000. Lenin didn't hide the logic behind it. He told Dzerzhinsky in blunt terms that the state was an instrument of coercion and that they intended to organize violence in the name of the workers. Survival came at a price. In March 1918, with the German army advancing and Russia's own forces in collapse, Lenin agreed to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, pulling Russia out of the First World War by handing over roughly a third of the old empire's population, more than half its industry, and almost all of its coal mines. Lenin called the terms an abyss of defeat and humiliation. He signed anyway. Staying in the war meant risking power at home, and losing power at home was the one outcome he wasn't willing to accept. Opposition kept building regardless, from the political right and from former socialist allies who felt betrayed by both the treaty and the dissolved assembly. Then, on August 30th, 1918, a socialist revolutionary named Fanny Kaplan shot Lenin 3 times outside a Moscow factory. He survived. Kaplan didn't. She was executed without a public trial 4 days later. Her body, according to multiple accounts, was burned in a barrel. That attempt became the trigger. 6 days after it, Lenin's government issued a formal decree ordering mass shootings, to be, in the government's own phrase, inflicted without hesitation. Officially, it was called the Red Terror. It did exactly what the name promised. How many people it killed is still disputed. The Cheka's own internal figures, almost certainly undercounted, put the toll around 12 to 13,000 in the terror's first years. Independent historians working from archives opened after the Soviet collapse put the real number well beyond that. Estimates run from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands, with a handful of researchers arguing for figures over 1 million, though those higher numbers aren't widely accepted. What isn't disputed is the method: arrest based on class, not crime, execution without trial, hostages taken to control entire populations. Dzerzhinsky described the goal himself, plainly: to terrorize and eliminate the enemies of the revolution based on who they were, not what they'd done. The Red Terror didn't happen in isolation. By the time it started, the country was already tearing itself apart. Lenin's Russia was now fighting a civil war on top of everything else. His Red Army against a patchwork of anti-Bolshevik white forces, with foreign troops from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States wading in against him. 4 years of fighting killed somewhere between 7 and 10 million people, most of them civilians, dead from disease and starvation rather than combat. The war economy behind it was called war communism: nationalize everything and take the peasants' grain by force if they wouldn't sell it. It helped win the war. It also gutted Russian agriculture. The harvest fell by more than half in 3 years. Then came the drought. The famine that hit the Volga region in 1921 and 1922 ranks among the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. 16 million people went hungry. The most commonly cited death toll is around 5 million. Relief workers documented, independently and repeatedly, families resorting to cannibalism to survive. Lenin, who had previously turned down American offers of aid as foreign interference, finally accepted it. At its peak, Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration was feeding up to 11 million people a day, out of 19,000 kitchens, in a country whose own government had spent years insisting it didn't need the help. The famine and the war it grew out of were still unfolding in March 1921. The same month the government finally answered a very different kind of hunger from people who'd fought for the revolution in the first place. Same month. March 1921. At the Kronstadt naval fortress outside Petrograd, the sailors rose up. These were the same men Trotsky had once called, back in 1917, the pride and glory of the Russian Revolution. Not for the Tsar, not for capitalism. Their demands were almost modest, for a country that called itself a workers' state, free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech for workers and peasants, and an end to the armed requisition squads that had helped starve the countryside. The government's answer was an ultimatum dropped over the fortress by leaflet: surrender, or be shot like partridges. When the sailors didn't surrender, the Red Army crossed the frozen Gulf and took the fortress by force. About 2,000 sailors were executed, most without trial. Around 8,000 escaped across the ice into Finland. These weren't counter-revolutionaries. They were the revolution's own soldiers, asking their own government to deliver what it had promised back in 1917. They were shot for asking. At that same party congress, while the assault on Kronstadt was still being finalized, Lenin pushed through one more measure: a formal ban on organized factions inside his own Communist Party. No internal blocs, no internal opposition. From that point on, dissent wasn't just illegal outside the party. It was illegal inside it too. That same Congress, almost as a pressure release, also approved the new economic policy, bringing back small private trade and easing the grain requisitions. It's usually called a retreat, and economically, it was one. Markets returned, and by the mid-1920s, farm output had recovered close to pre-war levels. But notice what didn't come back. Not the Constituent Assembly, not the opposition parties, not a free press. The economy got room to recover. Politics never did. By the end of 1922, the structure was in place. On December the 30th, delegates from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics signed the treaty creating the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the formal, permanent version of the one-party state. Lenin had been assembling piece by piece for 5 years. He didn't get to enjoy it for long. He'd already suffered a first stroke that May. A second, that December, ended his active political career almost entirely. In his final working weeks, dictating notes to a secretary because he could no longer write by hand, Lenin produced what history now calls his testament: private, unpublished warnings about the men positioned to succeed him. About Joseph Stalin, recently installed as General Secretary of the Communist Party, Lenin wrote something striking. Stalin, he said, was too rude, a flaw that might be tolerable among comrades, but intolerable in a man who now held, in Lenin's own words, enormous and dangerous power. He recommended finding a way to remove Stalin from the post before it was too late. He'd spent 5 years building a machine with no court, no rival parties, and no internal dissent. In his final lucid weeks, he was afraid of who might inherit it. He was right to be. Lenin died on January the 21st, 1924, at age 53. His testament was read, quietly, restricted to individual delegations rather than the full party Congress a few months later. Then it was buried. Stalin's allies made sure of that, using the exact tools Lenin had built for silencing inconvenient things. Historians still argue about how directly to connect the two men. Richard Pipes calls Stalin the faithful executor of Lenin's own program. He's got a point. It was Lenin, not Stalin, who invented the Red Terror and the ban on internal opposition. Robert Service draws a softer line. Lenin laid the foundation, but the road to Stalin's much larger terror wasn't automatic. Others, including some of Lenin's own old comrades, called it a betrayal, not a continuation. Nobody disputes the sequence, though. One election, lost and shut down. A secret police built to make the shutdown stick. An assassination attempt turned into an excuse for mass terror. A revolutionary base crushed for asking its own government to keep its word. Dissent outlawed even inside the party that had just won. War and famine killed people on their own. The rest of it didn't happen by accident. It was built. Today, in Red Square, you can still see him. Lenin's embalmed body has been on public display there for over a century now, preserved by a formula the Russian government still hasn't fully disclosed. It's a fitting image in its way. A country that hasn't held a real, competitive national election since he shut one down in January 1918 is still, quite literally, propping up his body as its founding relic. He built the machine to survive an election he'd lost. It outlived him by a century.